Exposé, The 2-Degree Death Dance, The 1-Degree Cover-Up, Part 1 of an Investigative Report, by Cory Morningstar, the 10th of December, 2010, published in Huntington News, the 18th of December, 2010. If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. Leo TZU. Behind every tragedy there is a story. This story is non-fiction and begins in the 1980s. It involves the Rockefeller-funded village conferences, the entrance of the neoclassical economists, propaganda, and most importantly the disappearance of the 1E temperature threshold cited as the safe limit in 1990 by the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. Like so many stories, there was a villain. In this story, the villain's name was Insatiable Greed, like the Agent Smith virus, uploaded into the Matrix. Insatiable Greed was a terminating virus capable of multiplying. Insatiable Greed was warned by the United Nations Working Group that beyond 1E there might be rapid, unpredictable and non-linear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. He was also warned that a 2E increase was viewed as an upper limit beyond which the risks of grave damage to ecosystems, and of non-linear responses, are expected to increase rapidly. Non-linear in this case means runaway climate change. Earth and her inhabitants would clearly be threatened if the 1E threshold was to be exceeded. However, Insatiable Greed did not listen. Insatiable Greed dismissed the wise advice, only interested in knowing how much further destruction could be continued before the Earth would reach her maximum limit where catastrophe would be unavoidable. Being the virus he was, Insatiable Greed used the tools available to successfully infect and multiply, effectively burying the initial warning of 1E, thus ensuring the Earth's inhabitants would believe the extremely dangerous threshold of 2E would be safe. This is the story. The origins of 2E. Neoclassical economist Bill Nordhaus. The 2E temperature rise target, which is the only limit in the text of the noted Copenhagen Accord, may well be one of the least understood cover-ups in history. The first suggestion to use 2 degrees Celsius as a critical temperature limit for climate policy was not made by an esteemed climate scientist. Rather, it was made by well-known neoclassical economist W.D. Nordhaus, in a discussion paper of the prestigious Cowles Foundation. In 1977, Nordhaus stated, if there were global temperatures more than 2 or 3 degrees above the current average temperature, this would take the climate outside of the range of observations which have been made over the last several 100,000 years. 1. This temperature increase is in fact well outside of the natural limits of the past 10,000 years during which agriculture and civilization developed. It is also higher than has existed over the past couple of million years. Rich man's cat may drink the milk that a poor boy needs to remain healthy. Does this happen because the market is failing? Not at all. For the market mechanism is doing its job, putting goods in the hands of those that have the dollar votes. The author of the ice-cold quote above is none other than our neoclassical economist and Yale University professor Bill Nordhaus. Nordhaus and Samuelson. 2005. Originator of the now infamous 2E threshold target that has come to dominate climate discussions and to dismiss all sensibilities as our Earth spins toward a terrifying, irreversible apocalypse. Today, this 2E target, largely defined as the maximum allowable warming to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate, has replaced an almost unknown 1E target highlighted in the 1990 UNAGGG, United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, report when climate change as a global issue was widely unknown. Nordhaus has been one of the most influential economists involved in climate change models and construction of emissions scenarios for well over 30 years, having developed one of the earliest economic models to evaluate climate change policy. He has steadfastly opposed the drastic reductions in greenhouse gases emissions necessary for averting global catastrophe, arguing instead for a slow process of emissions reduction, on the grounds that it would be more economically justifiable. In a brilliant review by Richard York, Brett Clark and John Bellamy Foster, the frightening logic of Nordhaus is fully exposed. The origins of 1E, United Nations 1990, B, E and 1 degree Celsius may elicit rapid, unpredictable and non-linear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. In 1986, 3 international bodies, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, who had co-sponsored the Villach Conference in 1985, formed the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, AGGG, a small international committee with responsibility for assessing the available scientific information about the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the likely impact. In 1990, the AGGG calculated what level of climate change our planet could tolerate, also referred to as environmental limits. These levels and limits were summarized in the document, Responding to Climate Change, Tools for Policy Development, published by the Stockholm Environment Institute. The targets and indicators set limits to rates and total amounts of temperature rise and sea level rise, on the basis of known behavior of ecosystems. The AGGG report identified these limits in order to protect both ecosystems as well as human systems. The report states that the objective is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, human-made, interference with the climate system. It adds, such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Thus the report requires limits to both the total amount of change and the rate of change. Further, they warn that a global temperature increase beyond 1 degree Celsius may elicit rapid, unpredictable and non-linear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. A temperature increase of 2°C was viewed as an upper limit beyond which the risks of grave damage to ecosystems, and of non-linear responses, are expected to increase rapidly. For non-linear, read Runaway Global Climate Change. 2. The Framework Convention on Climate Change signed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 should have ensured that staying within the AGGG identified ecological limit of a 1°C temperature rise is a central objective. But it didn't. This investigation attempts to spell out why. From the AGGG report, the low-risk indicators, sea level rise, maximum rate of rise of 20-50 mm per decade, maximum total rise of 20-50 cm above 1990 global mean sea level, global mean temperature, maximum rate of increase of 0.1°C per decade, maximum total increase of 1.0°C. The AGGG report also identified the CO2 equivalent concentrations corresponding to these as 330-400 ppm for 1°C and 400-560 ppm for 2°C. It is critical to understand these concentrations cited from the report are far below the 350 ppm that has become the status quo target of today. Citing a need for climate stabilization, a Dutch Ministry of Environment-funded project concluded in 1988 that this would preferably be at just 1°C above pre-industrial temperatures, but certainly with a maximum target of 400 ppm CO2 concentration. Cross, 1988. Further origins of 2°C Environmental Defense Fund and Rockefeller. Altering the framing of the climate change issue. Cost-benefit analysis, CBA, is used like a Bible to convey and perpetuate an image of science being driven by facts as opposed to politics. The high-risk 2°C targets does not take note of the fact we are beyond dangerous climate interference today, and that even 1°C represents an immediate danger today. Rather, it represents the cost-benefit view. This view is to justify the limit by comparing benefits of avoiding climate damages with costs of reducing economic growth. In this case, instead of the benefit being the benefit of staying alive, the benefit is expressed as percentage points of gross domestic product (GDP). Further origins of 2°C trace back to a traffic light system in the early 1990s. 4. As well as discussions within the Bellagio workshops held in Europe in 1987. Gordon Goodman, an AGGG member and executive director of the Bayer Institute, later the Stockholm Environment Institute, received money from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to commission 2 inter-linked workshops in September and November 1987 at Villach and Bellagio respectively. On the 28th of September 1987, the first of 2 workshops convened in Villach, Austria. 3. In the report it states that the workshops were carried out under the auspices of AGGG. The report states that AGGG members had limited input and control over these workshops. It is reported that papers contributed by 20 scientists, economists, and policy experts provided background material for working sessions where some 50 scientists and other technical experts from 14 developed and developing countries examined the consequences of the emissions of greenhouse gases, with measures that might be used to limit or adapt to these effects. It is stated that the objective of the Village workshop was to provide a technical basis for deliberations by a group of high-level policymakers which convened subsequently at Bellagio, Italy, on November 9, 1987. The said findings and the recommendations of the Bellagio workshop appear in a report titled Developing Policies for Responding to Climatic Change, Jaeger, 1988. Published by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme in April 1988. The project to organize the two workshops was initiated by the Bayer Institute, for whom Bill Nordhaus has written numerous papers, the Environmental Defense Fund, U.S., and the Woods Hole Research Center, U.S. A steering committee included Michael Oppenheimer from Environmental Defense Fund, while sponsorship was provided by a small handful including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, U.S., the German Marshall Fund, U.S., Rockefeller Foundation, U.S., and the Bayer Institute. This workshop was supported by AGGG and behind them the Stockholm Environment Institute, say. The Bellagio conference proposed that policymakers should set a maximum rate of temperature increase at 0.1 E per decade as the maximum tolerable limit and a second target, and a 1 E2 E above pre-industrial temperature target. This appears to one the earliest references to a 2 E maximum temperature change, along with rate of change, from a working group. The underlying principle for the rate of change target was that of the adaptability of ecosystems to climatic change, whereas in the case of the temperature target it was the boundary between changes that could be accommodated without serious or costly implications. However, the goal of 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade could only be achieved with significant reductions in fossil fuel use. World Climate Programme, 1988, page 24, emphasis in original. Investigation into these workshops raises many questions. It has been suggested that the Village Conference was critical to altering the framing of the climate change issue. It was known at that time that to reach the 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade target, the rate of CO2 emissions could have to be reduced by up to 66%. Rockefellers were now embedded with those who would be addressing policy change. Such policy, yet to be written, would be the principal means of effectively ending global society's addiction to fossil fuels, which would effectively destroy the Rockefeller empire built on oil. From 1968 to 1978, Frederick Seitz was president of Rockefeller University as well as chairman of the board of directors for the Science and Environmental Policy Project, a project set up to advocate global warming skepticism. Seitz was also the founding chairman of the George C. Marshall Institute, a tobacco industry consultant and a prominent skeptic on the issue of global warming. In what must be the most bitter of ironies, the 2 degrees Celsius limit re-emerged in 1990, in the same influential UNAGGG paper where the 1 E is cited. 2 E was also cited as being a high-risk target. Ridge-Spillman, Swart, 1990. We can only assume that pressure from outside and within the negotiations, from governments influenced and controlled by both corporations and economists, must have played a crucial role in killing off the 1 E suggested temperature rise the world was warned not to surpass. Psychotic delusion. In an address titled Economic Issues in Designing a Global Agreement on Global Warming presented by Nordhaus to the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Science, the 10th to the 12th of March 2009, Nordhaus argues that it is not legitimate to try to second-guess the market, going so far as to propose that people may come to love the altered landscape of the warmer world. It is most revealing that the world's foremost scientists on climate change, who understand the terrifying risks we now face due to lack of action, invited one of the most influential voices calling for caution and moderation to give a keynote address. Nordhaus uses his own magical economical model to spit out the very best apocalyptic scenario he would like our governments to adopt. 1. In Nordhaus's skewed view, that strengthens the economy. If the world does nothing, Nordhaus believes, we will reach a temperature increase of 3.1 E by 2100, a gross underestimate by most standards, and 5.3 E by 2200. Instead, he suggests, the world should choose to spend what allows the temperature to rise by 2.6 E by 2100, increasing to 3.5 by 2200. Keep in mind that any temperature increase will eventually double for future generations due to the inertia of the climate system. He presents a scenario delusion, which supports atmospheric concentrations rising to approximately 700 ppm, despite the fact that scientists claim such temperature increases will be catastrophic beyond measure. Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, states our survival would very much depend on how well we were able to draw down carbon dioxide to 280 ppm. To Nordhaus, his numbers are nothing less than an epiphany. Rather than doing nothing at all, we can save the world $3 trillion. He insists that any attempt to stay below 2.6 C, accepting that this is an eventual rise to 5.3 E, would be a big mistake. Wassily Leontief and John Kenneth summarize this delusional train of thought quite strikingly. Departments of economics are graduating a generation of idiot savants, brilliant at esoteric mathematics yet innocent of actual economic life. Of course, this description does not apply to all economists, and there are the mavericks such as Kenneth Boulding, Howard Odum, Hazel Henderson, E.F. Schumacher and Herman Daly, to name a few. In a 1997 paper, Linking Weak and Strong Sustainability Indicators, The Case of Global Warming, the authors defined the neoclassical delusion as follows. In several contributions, damage cost calculations of climate change like that of Nordhaus, 1991, Klein, 1991, and Fankhauser, 1995, were criticized especially from an ecological perspective. It had been argued that mere neoclassical optimization concepts tend to ignore the ecological, ethical and social dimension of the greenhouse effect, especially issues of an equitable distribution and a sustainable use of non-substitutable, essential functions of ecosystems. The ecological argument addresses the use of damage cost values for computing optimal levels of emission abatement, neglecting the special function of the atmosphere as a sink for greenhouse gases. This function is absolutely scarce and essential for the global ecosystem. It is feared that, by putting certain monetary values on this essential natural function, politicians may be encouraged to sell it in exchange for goods being possibly at higher value in a short time horizon. For example, income. Science is politics, politics is science. In the 1980s, although there was scientific uncertainty in regards to the precise time, location and nature of particular impacts, scientists stated it was inevitable that in the absence of major preventive and adaptive undertakings by humanity, significant and potentially disruptive changes in the Earth's environment would occur, and that human-induced climate change would have profound consequences for the world's social and natural systems. Responding to these dire warnings, the redesigning and innovation towards decarbonization of energy systems comprised just one of several preventive measures that found itself moving up on the policy agenda towards the late 1980s. This was a direct result of the active policy engagement by a range of scientific institutions. The urgent scientific call for global action to prevent potential climate catastrophe opened the door to the global politics of the climate. Intergovernmental negotiations soon transformed the vision of prevention into a more restricted mitigation adaptation agenda. By 1992, it is clear that influential interest groups and powerful institutions had become heavily involved in the negotiations, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, OPEC countries, oil, importing developing nations and private industry corporations. The OECD has been heavily criticized by several civil society groups as well as developing states. The main criticism has been the narrowness of the OECD on account of its limited membership to a select few wealthy states. In 1997 to 1998, the draft Multilateral Agreement on Investment, MAI, was heavily criticized by developing states. Many argued that the agreement would threaten protection of human rights, labor and environmental standards, and the most vulnerable countries. Critics argued, correctly, that the MAI would result in a race to the bottom among countries willing to lower their labor and environmental standards to attract foreign investment. The OECD's actions against harmful tax practices has also raised criticism. The primary objection is the sanctity of tax policy as a matter of sovereign entitlement. Saudi Arabia played a key role interfering, and shaping international climate policy since international negotiations began in the 1990s in order to ensure that the billion-dollar oil industry would not be affected. As a consequence of such interference by many powerful players who sought to ensure the economic and political power structure would not be threatened, adaptation surfaced as the primary goal in international climate science and policy, effectively replacing the goals of prevention and mitigation from the 1980s. By 1992, unwilling to sacrifice economic growth, negotiating parties rejected strict targets and timetables for emissions reductions. Rather, through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, countries avoided the necessary targets and trajectories by instead agreeing to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere at a level that were to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. The result would be a vicious race to the bottom. Science became politics. Politics became science. Which brings us to our current climate crisis we now face dead-on. A recent and revealing example of questionable politics within science can be found in Hansen's recent papers. Although the Arctic sea ice is diminishing faster than what scientists ever thought possible, Hansen recently revised the number required to refreeze the Arctic sea ice upwards, from 300-325 ppm to 300-350 ppm. Considering we have feedbacks which are now operational, this revision can be hard to believe. This is a brilliant example of questionable politics within a realm of brilliant scientists. One could argue that as we are at 390 CO2 today, the melting of the ice in the Arctic could be caused by being over 350 ppm. To date, this upward revision has gone relatively unchallenged. The first Hansen paper published establishing 300-325 ppm for the Arctic sea ice was published prior to the creation of the brand 350 org. When McKibben and Hansen were criticized and asked the obvious question, why was 350 org focusing an entire campaign on the number brand 350 when the safe boundary for the planet was under 325 ppm? The number was revised upwards. Further, the Science of Veron et al. States that temperature-induced mass coral bleaching causing mortality on a wide geographic scale started when atmospheric CO2 levels exceeded 320 ppm. When CO2 levels reached 340 ppm, sporadic but highly destructive mass bleaching occurred in most reefs worldwide, often associated with El Niño events. So why aim for 350? It is possible that the science has been adjusted to accommodate the 350 org brand. This brand has been funded by Rockefeller Brothers and others who are set to lose if the world were to do what is necessary to get back down to 300 ppm. That being a complete abandonment of fossil fuels. The abandonment of fossil fuels is the greatest threat to the current power and monetary structure in the world. Hansen says Arctic sea ice passed its tipping point decades ago, and in his presentations has also specifically identified 300-325 ppm as the target range for sea ice restoration. See slide image, as did the paper. Open Atmos, C. J2, 217-231. This view, by perhaps the most eminent climate scientist in America, is reinforced by Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, head of the Potsdam Institute, who goes further, stating our survival would very much depend on how well we were able to draw down carbon dioxide to 280 ppm. 2008. Hansen, where should humanity aim? A further imbalance reduction, and thus CO2 300-325 ppm, may be needed to restore sea ice to its area of 25 years ago. Assessment of target CO2. Phenomenon target CO2. ppm. 1. Arctic sea ice 300-325. 2. Ice sheet sea level 300-350. 3. Shifting climatic zones 300-350. 4. Alpine water supplies 300-350. 5. Avoid ocean acidification 300-350. 2010. Hansen, French National Assembly, May 2010. Assessment of target CO2. Phenomenon target CO2. ppm. 1. Arctic sea ice 300-350. 2. Ice sheet sea level 300-350. 3. Shifting climatic zones 300-350. 4. Alpine water supplies 300-350. 5. Avoid ocean acidification 300-350. An excerpt from Climate Code read, 350 is the wrong target. Put the science first. Horizontal ellipsis. But that is only half the story. Here's what else Hansen et al. Said, emphasis added, in their article in Open Atmos. C. J2. 217-231. Equilibrium sea level rise for today's 385 ppm CO2 is at least several meters, judging from paleoclimate history. Accelerating mass losses from Greenland and West Antarctica heighten concerns about ice sheet stability. An initial CO2 target of 350 ppm, to be reassessed as effects on ice sheet mass balance are observed, is suggested. It is important to note that this paragraph is not about the Arctic sea ice tipping point, it's about Antarctica. Hansen explains in the same article that 350 ppm is a precautionary target to stop global loss of ice sheets, because the paleoclimate record shows 450 ppm plus or minus 100 ppm as boundary for glaciation-deglaciation of Antarctica. In the next paragraph, attention turns to the question of Arctic sea ice. Stabilization of Arctic sea ice cover requires, to first approximation, restoration of planetary energy balance. Climate models driven by known forcings yield a present planetary energy imbalance of plus 0.51 WM2. Observed heat increase in the upper 700 meters of the ocean confirms the planetary energy imbalance, but observations of the entire ocean are needed for quantification. CO2 amount must be reduced to 325-355 ppm to increase outgoing flux 0.5 to 1 WM2. If other forcings are unchanged, a further imbalance reduction, and thus CO2 300-325 ppm, may be needed to restore sea ice to its area of 25 years ago. The central point is that Arctic sea ice is undergoing dramatic loss in summer, having lost 70-80% of its volume in the last 50 years, most since 2000. Without summer sea ice, Greenland cannot escape a trajectory of ice sheet loss leading to an eventual sea level rise of 7 meters. Regional temperatures in the Arctic autumn are already up about 5 C, and by mid-century an Arctic ice-free in summer, combined with more global warming, will be pushing Siberia close to the point where large-scale loss of carbon from melting permafrost would make further mitigation efforts futile. As Hansen told the U.S. Congress in testimony last year, the elements of a perfect storm, a global cataclysm, are assembled. In short, if you don't have a target that aims to cool the planet sufficiently to get the sea ice back, the climate system may spiral out of control, past many tipping points to the final point of no return. And that target is not 350 ppm, it's around 300 ppm. 350 org, the most powerful, most aggressive agreement on climate in existence to this day, the People's Agreement, was written at the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in April 2010 in Cochabamba, Bolivia. 350 org fought to highlight their brand number in the agreement. They did not succeed. McKibben now makes reference to 350 ppm as being the upper limit, and in a recent radio interview McKibben stated that pre-industrial levels might be the only safe zone, in spite of his acknowledgement of pre-industrial levels being a safe zone, despite mention of the 280 ppm in a recent future scenario written by McKibben himself. And despite pressure from climate justice groups and activists, 350 org refuses to endorse the Cochabamba People's Agreement. This agreement is the only democratic agreement ever drafted to date that has the potential to save civilization from catastrophic climate change. McKibben states 350 org will not endorse the agreement as Hansen does not agree with the science of 300 ppm. This is ironic as on the 350 org website it now reads, these considerations have led 350 org to see the 350 ppm target not only in terms of CO2, but CO2e. On a technical level, this becomes a more ambitious target, incorporating other greenhouse gases. On a practical level, it signifies the same priorities 350 has embodied all along. Any climate target lower than where we are right now, be it 350 CO2e, 350 CO2, or anything else, represents a transformative shift in how the world operates. In effect, 350 org, now recognizing themselves as 350 ppm goes beyond the targets of even that of Korchap Ambar. So what is the real reason they do not endorse it? Or maybe 350 just means whatever you want it to mean. After it all, it's just a brand under the TCK corporate umbrella, and without an expedient plan to zero, it is meaningless. John Holderan, we are already beyond dangerous. Such an action is impossible to justify today. Leading climate scientist John Holderan on 3 November 2006. Climate change is coming at us faster, with larger impacts and bigger risks, than even most climate scientists expected as recently as a few years ago. The stated goal of the UNFCCC, avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate, is in fact unattainable, because today we are already experiencing dangerous anthropogenic interference. The real question now is whether we can still avoid catastrophic anthropogenic interference in climate. There is no guarantee that catastrophe can be avoided even we start taking serious evasive action immediately, but it's increasingly clear that the current level of anthropogenic interference is dangerous. Significant impacts in terms of floods, droughts, wildfires, species, melting ice already evident at 0.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial TAG. Current GHG concentrations commit us to 0.6 degrees Celsius more. 5. Furthermore, James Hansen has been pressing for a global climate state of emergency since 2008. Paleoclimate scientist Andrew Glikson, interviewed by Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, Radio Australia, 2009, in response to the question what has to be done, stated, extremely rapid reduction in emissions. I would say 80% within the next 10 years or so. People like me have been looking at the evidence about this on a day-to-day basis, and we have been doing it for years. And to look into the abyss at this length is a daunting task. My view is that the climate has already crossed at least one tipping point, about 1975 to 1976, and is now at a runaway state, implying that only emergency measures have a chance of making a difference. The costs of all of the above would require diversion of the trillions of dollars from global military expenditures to environmental mitigation. 2010, Andrew Glikson, Expose, The 2-Degree Death Dance, The 1-Degree Cover-Up, Part 2 of an investigative report, by Cory Morningstar, Bolivia versus the World. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. George Orwell, the 11th of December 2010. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, Conference of the Parties, COP 16 in Cancun, Mexico. Bolivia repeatedly opposes attempts to pass the text. Bolivia's UN ambassador, Pablo Solán, objects on the grounds that the draft proposals are far too lax to stop global warming. Solán stands his ground until conference chair Patricia Espinosa bangs the gavel at 3:31 a.m. saying, "The objections and complaints will be noted duly. A key clause of United Nations rules is that all agreements must be reached in harmony." However, Espinosa seems to have a very broad interpretation of this rule. Harmony, Espinosa stated, does not necessarily mean unanimity. Despite the lack of unanimity, Espinosa approves the text, which includes a deadly 2-degree limit for global warming. The negotiators and heads of state cheer like ravenous hyenas, drowning out Bolivia with rapturous applause. Bolivia stood alone, strenuously opposing the Pyrrhic victory. The overruling of Bolivia's position demonstrates the clear disdain and callous disregard for vulnerable countries who refuse to be coerced, reflected clearly by the jettisoned UN principle of consensus. This clear abuse of the framework agreement on climate protection would never have been attempted or tolerated if the state in opposition had been a rich, powerful state such as the United States or the European Union, EU. One may recall COP13 in Bali. American resistance stood in the way of an agreement. Papua New Guinea had to suggest that they let or get out of the way before the US would join the consensus. Bolivia, the world leader in the battle on climate change, has vowed to file a complaint with the International Court of Justice against the text approved in Cancun. A primary reason why Bolivia opposed the so-called Cancun agreements was the fact that the 2E target, identified as extremely dangerous, completely disregards the climate science as well as the accelerating climate impacts and climate feedbacks already happening today. Another very revealing component to this document is the language. 4. With a view to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions so as to hold the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and that parties should take urgent action to meet this long-term goal. The word should in policy does not demand commitment. In legal documents, shall this considered mandatory. If I tell my son he should clean his room rather than he will, shall or must clean his room, I know damn well it is never going to happen. A future binding or non-binding agreement, one that parties should take urgent action on, demands no accountability whatsoever. The word should appears in the document 38 times. In stark contrast, the word must appears only 4 times. The fact that the Cancun agreements passed without consensus, the UNFCCC consensus rule is adoption by virtue of no objection or unanimity, meaning all 192 members voting in favor, is revealing. On the 7th of December 2009, at COP15 in Copenhagen, Papua New Guinea proposed that, rather than descend to the lowest common denominator, the parties should strive for consensus with a fallback of 75%. This proposal was summarily dismissed by the chair. 1. 21st Century Suicide Pact. Sold, our Earth's shared atmosphere, a catastrophically dangerous 2°C temperature rise, as well as the commodification of Earth's final remaining natural resources, was accepted by all countries save Bolivia. Over 70% of atmospheric space. The US is historically responsible for 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. The EU, 27%, has been designated to the wealthiest 20% of the world, thus denying developing and vulnerable countries the opportunity to achieve the fundamental development necessary in order to meet their basic needs and transition to zero-carbon societies. This leaves 80% of humanity competing for the less than 30% remaining interest. The suffering and devastation that will result from the greatest heist in history is unparalleled desperation, starvation and death on a massive scale. Sold, life itself. During the last days of the Cancun Climate Summit, 5,000 Latin American campesinos blocked the main, and only, highway leading in and out of Cancun. In stark contrast, the rich of the wealthy obstructionist states lit a candle in the window of their warm, comfortable homes. How will citizens react when they finally realize, after wading through the rubbish heaps of corporate media propaganda, that the value of human life was tossed on the garbage heap in Cancun in order to protect the global economy? It is true that those in the Pacific Ocean, the vulnerable atolls, Bolivia and Africa will be burying their children and loved ones before the wealthy, obstructionist states, such as my own, must bury theirs. But make no mistake, very few people, if any, will escape nature's final performance, without urgent emergency action. Rapid climate shifts resulting from runaway climate change are practically inevitable with the suicide pact that was passed, without consensus, in Cancun. The art of propaganda has been nothing less than brilliant. The deceit is so thick, you need a knife to cut through it. The corruption and greed so deep you need wings to stay above it and thigh-high boots to wade through it. An alluring tapestry of luminous lies, interwoven with finely textured deception and silk-like corruption, as smooth and seductive as freshly churned butter. The pursuit of man's mind by way of domination has been the greatest and most successful experiment. The manipulation of man's mind has resulted in a massive erosion of empathy, which has allowed status quo business as usual to continue uninterrupted with little resistance. Capitalism effectively bred a contempt for our Earth that multiplied like a virus. The pollution of mind mutated into narcissism with inflicted self-hatred to form a suicidal Molotov cocktail. Those who have succumbed now hold hands in a circle and taunt the very planet that gives us life. The ugly side of humanity continues to violently pierce our Earth Mother with drills and slash her beautiful skin with razors. She is losing breath. She is dying. Yet, when she lashes back, it will be with an Armageddon death blow against which our own actions will resemble childish prattle. And perhaps not until this time will global society finally recognize that our shared purpose was not to compete with one another and claim dominance and superiority over our Earth Mother, but rather our role was to protect, defend and nurture the human family. Under the arm of its Euro-American Big Brother will have finally succeeded in conquering our shared planet, only to find that we have destroyed ourselves. Climate genocide. Major greenhouse gas, GHG, emitting developed states continued to dominate the climate talks in Cancun as the Earth burned. Corporate media continue to pander to those who own them, those who control the system. The major GHG-emitting developed states have and will continue to coerce, bribe and bully the strong developing states such as Bolivia and the vulnerable states such as Tuvalu. Such vulnerable states, as well as Africa, will be decimated if temperatures are allowed to rise by 2°C. In reality, we are now looking at 3°C to 5°C. Further, a global temperature rise of 3°C to 5°C will mean much higher temperature extremes for Africa, a furnace for African agriculture, certain death, the harsh history of the continued exploitation, the raping and pillaging of beautiful Africa and her people, will finally be complete. There will be nothing left for rich nations to steal except for the sun's energy falling on an empty landscape void of life, and there is little doubt the world's wealthiest, ethically bankrupt states will steal this. 2. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction, in whole or in part, of an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group. While a precise definition varies among genocide scholars, a legal definition is found in the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, CPPCG. Article 2 of this convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, because of the influence of Joseph Stalin. This definition of genocide under international law does not include political groups. It should. This genocide is being carried out openly by the world's wealthiest, individuals and corporations alike, in collusion with the governments of the obstructionist states, with full knowledge of the consequences. Agriculture, the disappearing breadbasket. Strangely and eerily absent in scientific papers and IPCC reports is any reference to protection of agriculture. This is not an oversight. In 1987, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee noted the threat to agriculture in particular, and stated its belief that global warming is a potential environmental disaster on a scale only exceeded by nuclear war. Once the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, AGGG, low-risk temperature rise of 1°C was dismissed and essentially buried, the emphasis on protecting agriculture disappeared as well. When global temperatures increase by more than 1°C, approximately half of the world's agricultural regions will experience crop decline. But due to the ocean heat lag effect, that 1°C of increase will commit us to more than 1.5°C, which is food catastrophe for low latitude, the most climate change vulnerable nations and disastrous for food security and agricultural productivity in other regions. Above 2°C is global food catastrophe with agriculture in decline globally, taking civilization with it. Keep in mind that scientists believe the agreements from Cancun represent a real-life 3°C to 5°C temperature rise this century as early as 2040 to 2050, and a global 7°C if even the paltry commitments are not honored. This coming loss of agriculture, known yet ignored, will amount to certain mass genocide as millions, becoming billions around the world, will be left without food. There will be no sharing of food as even wealthy countries will be hard-pressed to feed their own people. Importing for wealthy countries will be a thing of the past as vulnerable countries struggle to feed their own people. And all the while the Monsantos of the world will be salivating over the potential profits of genetically engineered foods, which could come to dominate and control the entire remaining food chain. An economy, no matter how strong, cannot provide nourishing soil, nor the right conditions to grow food. An economy, no matter how strong, cannot magically create water. Bolivians will lose access to water and, following, Africa will lose the ability to produce food. And all of the money in the world will not make this not so. 2. Does anyone care? Yeah, the Pentagon. Will the decision in Cancun to ignore food security led to violence, fundamentalism and terrorism, all directed at the wealthy GHG-emitting obstructionist states? What would you do if your children were dying in front of your eyes, because rich, developed nations were unwilling to stop growing their economies, unwilling to abandon a fossil fuel economy, unwilling to stop deforestation, unwilling to live within nature's limits? If everything around you is dying, You have nothing to lose through a violent retaliation. Not to worry. While disease cultural norms have kept the public distracted with shopping and irrelevant corporatized propaganda, the military has been gearing up for years for our upcoming climate wars. Indeed, while well-funded lobbyists engage the public in a deadly game of is global warming real, this issue was never a matter of dispute within the military and the US Pentagon itself. Within the realm of militarism, climate change and the deadly threats it presents have always been seen as unequivocal, and the dangers it presents are viewed as unparalleled in magnitude. From the National Security and Threat of Climate Change report, unlike the challenges that we are used to dealing with, these will come upon us extremely slowly, but come they will, and they will be grinding and inexorable. But maybe more challenging is that they will affect every nation, and all simultaneously. VADM Richard Truly. Such stark warnings, even from the highest officials in the military ranks, continue to be ignored. Climate imperialism. COP16. Cancun, Mexico. The largest economic conference in history was an epic failure for humanity. And as the world burns, the wealthy elite stuffed their custom gold-lined biryani pockets with dreams and promises of unsurpassed wealth predicated upon climate catastrophe in the 21st century. Ottmar Edenhofer, a German economist who is co-chair of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, IPCC, Working Group on Mitigation of Climate Change, stated in an interview on 14 November 2010, "The climate summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. It is a big mistake to discuss climate policy separately from the major themes of globalization. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." Although Edenhofer clearly recognizes and perhaps believes himself that there is no other way that wealthy obstructionist states will step up to the plate unless they can further enhance their economic power by commodifying the Earth's last remaining natural resources, he does state this: "What we need to look for is an oasis that is the non-carbon global economy. It's about the common departure for this oasis." Edenhofer states unequivocally that only a non-carbon global economy can prevent climate catastrophe. In complete contrast, the Cancun outcome clearly tells us that the major GHG-emitting developed states are absolutely not about to end their addiction to the fossil fuel economy. Yet the fact is, only if we achieve zero carbon, at a speed and magnitude unparalleled in our entire history, can we prevent climate catastrophe. IPCC 2007 Assessment Science Technical Report. Question 10.3. If emissions of greenhouse gases are reduced, how quickly do their concentrations in the atmosphere decrease? While more than half of the CO2 emitted is currently removed from the atmosphere within a century, some fraction, about 20% of emitted CO2 remains in the atmosphere for millennia. Because of the slow removal process, atmospheric CO2 will continue to increase in the long term even if its emission is substantially reduced from its present levels. In fact, only in the case of essentially complete elimination of emissions can the atmospheric concentration of CO2 ultimately be stabilized at a constant level. Ultimate denialism. In our unparalleled, corporatized mind game of ultimate denialism, we can pretend that green capitalism, green consumerism, conservation, flying less, the right light bulbs, transforming our Earth's forests into carbon markets, etc. will all avert climate catastrophe. But this is unfortunately not true. The only way to avert climate catastrophe is to end our dependency on all fossil fuels. Unfortunately for our children, this view has been painted with the corporate brush as radical, a most brilliant word recently hijacked by those who have sold us off in the name of greed. The word radical comes from the Latin ridiculus, meaning root. Radical analysis goes to the root of an issue or problem. Typically that means that while challenging the specific manifestations of a problem, radicals also analyze the ideological and institutional components as well as challenge the instated assumptions and conventional wisdom that obscure the deeper roots. Often it means realizing that what is taken as an aberration or deviation from a system is actually the predictable and or intended result of a system. 3. The word radical is not a derogatory word to denote wild people. It is a term to embrace, one that describes critical thinking, root causes and self-reflection. This is absolutely essential if we are to win the war on climate change. Yes, We can keep going on our suicidal journey, but the reality is that at the end of the road there will be nothing left except death. We are in a race to our own extinction, taking countless species with us, and it seems that if anyone tries to stand in our way with warning signs of danger ahead, they are pushed aside as we keep running as fast as we can, straight to the precipice. Death, lies and WikiLeaks. In Cancun, the wealthy obstructionist states, the states that are most responsible for the global planetary crisis in the first place, attempted to kill off the Kyoto Accord once and for all, replacing it with the noted Copenhagen Accord. This sleight of hand will effectively extinguish the threat of binding obligations on the wealthy nations while also eliminating the obligations of the 1992 Climate Convention. Any international climate accord that cites TUI, as sought in Copenhagen and Cancun, will be a legally and lethally binding agreement. What we are witnessing today is nothing less than the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. The largely unnoticed 2009 State of the Future report, the most comprehensive report ever produced to look at the future of the planet, states that due to climate change, billions of people will be condemned to poverty and much of civilization will collapse. Saving the lives of billions is clearly off the real agenda behind the international climate negotiations. It is clear that global monetary wealth has evolved to become the only real issue behind this broken, corrupted process. Even mainstream media recognize the glaringly obvious. The Guardian reports on the 3rd of December 2010 that hidden behind the Save the World rhetoric of the global climate change negotiations lies the dirty real-life politics. The powerful greenhouse gas-emitting states use money and threats to buy political support while spying and cyber warfare are used to seek out leverage, distrust, broken promises and creative accounting. Climate negotiations and how the US mounted a secret global diplomatic offensive to overwhelm opposition to the controversial Copenhagen Accord. The unofficial document that emerged from the ruins of the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit in 2009. The US diplomatic cables, made public by WikiLeaks, clearly revealed how the US looks for dirt on vulnerable and developing states opposed to its business-as-usual approach and its steadfast refusal to tackle global warming. Further, the leaked cables revealed how financial and other aid is used by the world's most powerful countries to gain political backing. WikiLeaks reveals unequivocally that climate prostitution amongst the obstructionist states has become status quo. In a US embassy cable, Conor Hedegaard, European Commissioner for Climate Action, suggested the AOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, countries could be our best allies given their need for financing. Hedegaard and Froman discussed the need to neutralize, co-opt or marginalize unhelpful countries including Venezuela and Bolivia. Hedegaard again links financial aid to support for the accord, noting the irony that the EU is a big donor to these countries. In April 2010, after this discussion, the US cut aid to Bolivia and Ecuador, citing opposition to the accord. The US, determined to keep their crumbling imperialist empire intact, has continued to seek allies to protect self-interests from states who could, in united fashion, threaten current global power structures. This is evident in a cable from Brussels on the 17th of February reporting a meeting between the Deputy National Security Advisor, Michael Froman, Hedegaard and other EU officials. Froman stated that the EU needed to learn from basics. 4 large developing countries, Brazil, South Africa, India and China, skill at impeding US and EU initiatives, thereby playing them off against each other in order to better handle third country obstructionism and avoid future train wrecks on climate. Hedegaard demonstrates the complicit silence of the EU by stating that she hoped the US noted the EU was muting its criticism of the US. To be constructive, it's not as though we didn't suspect this. Climate justice activists have been battling climate opportunists for years. It is just that now it appears the players are so egocentric, they're not even going to pretend otherwise. The question is, how did the greatest crisis ever to present itself to civilization come to be dominated by economic interests, in essence destroying our opportunity to prevent cataclysmic, irreversible climate change when we've understood for decades that it could be prevented? What happened to our threshold of 1, which in 1990 we were warned not to exceed? The death of 1, as discussed in Part 1. 20 years ago it was recommended by the UN Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, AGGG, that the global average temperature not be allowed to rise more than 1 on the very reasonable principle of precaution. Their recommendation was based on not exceeding the historical temperature limit that has existed throughout the age of agriculture. Civilization is based upon and now absolutely dependent upon agriculture. The IPCC was formed in 1988 out of the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, and the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, AGGG. Although proposals for the IPCC appear earlier, it appears that the formation of the IPCC was when the dynamics began to shift and climate change modelers, such as neoclassical economist Bill Nordhaus, became heavily involved and most influential. Managing climate risk responses rather than simply focusing on reducing carbon dioxide emissions became the leading imperative. However, the first assessment report, FAR, Working Group 1 published by the IPCC in 1990 included the following in the summary for policymakers. We calculate with confidence that immediate reductions in emissions from human activities of over 60% are needed to stabilize concentrations at today's levels. Page 1. Tragically for the children of today and tomorrow, despite scientists calling for urgent emission cuts in 1988 and the UNAGGG report in 1990 citing 1°C as the maximum temperature rise of the planet must not exceed, the 2°C target became predominant in global climate policy by 1996. Climate models had been introduced in order to establish if and how far the global temperature could be allowed to rise above 1°C. The original European Union, EU, policy was an easing up on the 1°C with a range of 1°C to 2°C. In 2001, the IPCC noted warming over 1.5°C raises serious potential threats for some systems and regions. In a short time, 2°C was cited as the absolute limit to avoid planetary catastrophe, runaway global climate change. Prior to this, the EU's position was that a 2°C temperature rise was not safe because 2°C could not ensure safety from runaway global climate change but would rather minimize it. From this time, the imperative 1°C seemed to simply disappear. The EU proposed 2°C as the policy target in 1996. 4. The European Council, 25 heads of government of the European Union, restated the 2°C target in 2005, concluding that it was both scientifically justifiable and, more telling, that it was vital to promote cost-effective action to ensure temperatures did not rise beyond the 2°C limit. Cost-effective is policy-making jargon implying that environmental protection measures will only be applied if it is certain that such measures will not result in any economic cost. Economic cost is determined by a cost-benefit analysis after externalizing social and environmental costs. In fact, the final paragraph of the final report of the 2007 IPCC Fourth Assessment, Synthesis Report, stated that it could not be said with certainty that mitigation of global climate change would have any economic benefits beyond the economic costs of unlimited global climate change. Also in 2005, the British, chairing the Group of 8, G8, meeting, reaffirmed the 2°C target. The statements made by the G8, although not legally binding, were made with the intent that the 2°C target would eventually become an accepted target of a global treaty. All 8 of the G8 countries were amongst the 15 top-ranked leading export countries in the world. As the Earth burns, a 2005 EU report stated that the European Council first agreed on the 2°C goal in 1996. Based predominantly on the impact studies assessed in the second assessment report of the IPCC, even though the IPCC suggested that the risk of severe climate change impacts would increase markedly beyond a temperature rise of 2°C. The EU considered 2°C as a threshold. This is confirmed as recently as October 2009 by the European Commission. 2°C. That threshold is important because it minimizes the risk of dangerous runaway climate change. The 2005 report continues that recent studies have strengthened the argument that the EU's target is high risk and that significant impacts on ecosystems and water resources are likely with a temperature increase as low as 1°C. The report notes that once the global average temperature increase exceeds 2°C, climate impacts on ecosystems, food production and water supply are projected to increase significantly. Unexpected climate responses are more likely, and irreversible catastrophic events may occur. In December 2010, a series of papers was published by the Royal Society. They are alarming. One critical paper, When Could Global Warming Reach 4°C? states that with high emissions and strong carbon cycle feedbacks, we could reach a lethal 4 as early as 2060. A separate paper, Beyond Dangerous Climate Change, Emission Scenarios for a New World, states that theme packs associated with TUI have been revised upwards. Sufficiently so TUI now more accurately represents the threshold between dangerous and extremely dangerous climate change. Kevin Anderson, director of the Tyndall Center, states in the published paper that if the world is to keep within a global temperature increase of 2°, this will require World War II-style rationing in the developed world. Peak delusion. Thousands of years from now, if there is still a human species on what will be left of Earth's biosphere, this will be a story that so defies all logic and all sensibilities, no one will ever believe it. It may seem impossible to imagine that an advanced society such as ours could choose, in essence, to destroy itself, but that is what we are now in the process of doing. Elizabeth Colbert, in Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change. Ironically, many consider humans to be a brilliant, superior species. There is a term for such a rational logic. It is defined as Homo economicus. Homo economicus, or economic human, is the concept in some economic theories of humans as rational and narrowly self-interested actors who have the ability to make judgments toward their subjectively defined ends. This theory stands in contrast to the concept of Homo reciprocans, which states that human beings are primarily motivated by the desire to be cooperative and improve their environment. The Homo economicus perverse view of the world has reached peak influence in past decades as neoclassical economics. Homo economicus. 13 November 2010. Emergence of the chair's text. All references to the Tianjin negotiated text. October 2010. And to proposals from Bolivia and the People's Agreement of Cochabamba. April 2010 recognized in UNFCCC text in Bonn. June 2010, have vanished. 6. The 8th of December 2010 in Cancun. After pressure from Bolivia, the chair reintroduced the bracketed section related to degrees 1E, 1.5E and 2E. However, she did not reintroduce key Tianjin bracketed sections, such as establishing an international tribunal. The 10th of December 2010, in the final text that passed the corrupted international climate negotiating process in Cancun, there is no mention of halting all further fossil fuel exploration, nor is there mention of major GHG emitting developed states commencing a plan to begin capping extractions of current reserves. Eliminated from the text was the reference to 1E and guaranteed human rights in every action. Technology transfer to developing countries was eliminated. Gone are mechanisms of enforcement, including the proposal for an international court of justice. There is no mention of the impact of war and military industries on greenhouse gas emissions, as wars emit more emissions than entire countries. There is no mention of stopping or even halting further expansion of the Canadian tar sands. The text includes no alternative options for reducing GHGs, no laws, positive regulation, or control of financial transactions. Proposals that Bolivia had made to ensure that humans create a different relationship with the rest of nature through defense and recognition of the rights of nature. The Cancun text implies there was consensus on launching new carbon market mechanisms even though this was not agreed upon. For example, the Earth's forests are to be transformed into carbon markets, a move that indigenous peoples from all over the world have opposed and continue to vehemently oppose. Bolivia's proposal for nations to conserve and preserve forests was not included. Of course, there is no mention in the text of why it is ethically unjust to profit from pollution of our shared atmosphere, therefore important to make the practice illegal. Gone from the text is the essential zero-carbon language, the most critical, most neglected and most denied aspect of climate change mitigation. Disregarded was the advice of the International Energy Agency, IEA, to end subsidies to fossil fuels, which amounted to $558 billion worldwide in 2008. In the meantime, our inaction on climate change in 2009 alone has cost $1 trillion. IEA. 5. Governments claim a limit of 450 ppm, yet the IEA estimates that due to complete inaction in 2009, it will now cost an additional $1 trillion to stabilize the atmosphere at 450 ppm. Of course, nothing has happened in 2010 either, and Cancun promised further inaction. The recent IEA report stated that further delay will only escalate the crisis, that stabilization at a deadly 450 ppm simply will not happen. In bitter irony, the investment necessary for the world to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies is approximately $30 trillion, approximately the same amount as the global transfer to the world's banks following the engineered banking crisis of 2008. The reality is ugly. Wealthy states have trillions in bailout money for saving the banks and corporations, but when it comes to saving lives of ordinary citizens, families and vulnerable peoples, such an investment is of no interest to the elites in power. The Cancun climate agreements were prepared in direct response to requests from parties urging the president to present a text that covers all the issues and paints the whole picture of the outcome. It reflects the current status of the efforts of the delegations to converge on a balanced outcome. 7. With the one exception noted, the being Bolivia, agree to continue to agree on nothing, commit to nothing, and do nothing to prevent planetary global climate catastrophe. Agree to abandon the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Agree to abandon the Kyoto Protocol principles. Agree to allow the global temperature to increase by 3 degrees Celsius to 4.2 E. Agree to ignore catastrophic impacts on world and regional food and water security. Agree to ignore the catastrophic risks to planet Earth from Arctic climate feedbacks. Agree to continue supporting the fossil fuel industry, committing to the collapse of agriculture, civilization, humanity and most life on Earth. Agree to deny that the world is into dangerous interference with the climate system. Agree to deny that a planetary global climate emergency exists. Agree to deny the human rights, especially the right to survival of the billions of most climate change vulnerable and indigenous peoples. Agree to deny the rights to survival and human rights of all future generations. Agree to deny the rights to survival of living ecosystems and all other species. Affirm that this agreement serves as a continuation of the delaying tactics and prevarication led by the industrialized nations in order to avoid complying with their human rights obligations and their obligations under the clear intent and terms of the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Propaganda does not deceive people, it merely helps them to deceive themselves. Eric Hoffer. Right now, the world must acknowledge and accept the reality that the UN climate change negotiations over the past 2 decades have served as nothing more than a brilliant and lethal distraction. A diversion that protected and allowed the global economic power structures to continue business as usual for the last 20 years while emissions soared a further 40%. A far cry from the 66% emission reductions that scientists already knew were necessary back in the 1980s if the world was to avoid climate catastrophe. Lost is the window of time we had to set in motion legitimate solutions and measures for transitioning to a global zero-carbon economy. Like the sham of corporate social responsibility and voluntary compliance, this process of climate change negotiations, too, has failed the people. A violent assault on the world's most vulnerable who have been thrown out with the swill. Have our intoxicated, manipulated minds become too diseased to see clearly what is happening now? Have we become so desensitized that we are prepared to watch billions suffer, starve and die, simply because we lack the imagination to see a better world and lack the strength and resistance necessary to demand it? The climate crisis is the final lap in the final race for what is left of the world's remaining resources. When the race is over, the winner will be alone, to preside over an Earth that will resemble a global nuclear holocaust, a world that reeks of decay and death, and all of the money in the world won't make it not so. The climate negotiations have become a corrupt, broken process, an instrument not to legitimately slash emissions but rather to further expand corporate profits at any and every expense. In this case, life itself. Next in part 3, economy versus life requires tyranny over mind. How did delusional thinking come to replace rational, critical thinking?